There is a quiet moment when the role becomes visible, a slow recognition that the path I walked did not end where I thought it would end. I remember noticing it in ordinary conversations. Someone would describe confusion, panic, or the strange feeling that their own mind had become unfamiliar territory. Something deep within me recognized that terrain immediately. The corridors, the spirals of meaning, the moment when the maps stopped working. My body would register it before words even formed. The labyrinth leaves an imprint like that. Long after the storms settle, the body still remembers the architecture. Psychology would call this the beginning of individuation, the stage Carl Jung described where the personality slowly reorganizes into a more integrated whole. Not the destruction of the ego, but its rebalancing. The parts that once fought each other begin forming workable relationships. Shadow, fear, insight, memory, all of them learning to share the same interior space. The mythic mirror for this moment appears not as a heroic battle, but as a long psychological journey inward. Jung described individuation as the slow weaving together of fragments into a coherent self. Not perfection, integration, the recognition that the labyrinth was never simply chaos. It was a structure designed to reveal the full landscape of the inner psyche. But integration does not mean escape from responsibility. If anything, it increases it. The clearer the internal world becomes, the more obvious the consequences of behavior appear. A person who has seen how quickly perception can distort does not take stability for granted. Individuation is not mystical completion. It is the moment I realize the journey changed my job. I am no longer just a traveler in the labyrinth. I am someone who knows the corridors exist. That recognition brings another pressure with it. Lineage, not ego lineage, but continuity with others who carried useful knowledge through suffering without turning that suffering into a throne. The edgewalker, the wounded healer, the elder whose injury became authority only because it was made honest through conduct. That is the only bridge role I trust, not mastery, service shaped by scars that have stopped pretending to be crowns. The first time you speak about the journey openly, something strange happens. The words feel heavier than expected, not because the story is dramatic, but because the responsibility inside it becomes clear. I remember explaining the labyrinth metaphor to someone who had never heard it before. The way curiosity can turn into confusion, how meaning multiplies when the mind begins searching too aggressively for answers. The importance of sleep and routine, and people willing to say no when the imagination starts running ahead of reality. As I spoke, I noticed something shift. The story was no longer about what happened to me. It was becoming a tool. In mythology, this stage appears as the hero returning with a gift. Campbell described it as the final movement of the journey. The traveler brings something useful back to the world. Fire, or knowledge, or law, or medicine. The gift does not belong to the hero alone. It exists because the descent produced something that can help others navigate the same terrain. But the myth also carries a warning. Returning with a gift does not make the traveler superior. It simply means he has a responsibility to translate what he learned without exaggeration or without further myth making. The hero who returns boasting about the darkness becomes another kind of danger. The real task is translation, explaining the terrain in language that keeps people grounded rather than intoxicated by symbolism. That means repeating the same anchors again and again. Sleep stabilizes perception. The body anchors awareness. Work and routine prevent the mind from drifting too far into abstraction. Community journey keeps the ego accountable. Meaning never cancels consequence. These principles sound almost boring compared with the intensity of the Labyrinth. But they are exactly what allows a person to survive it and to return to everyday life. Speaking publicly about the journey slowly revealed something else. The story was not really about the descent. It was about the thread. It was also about blessing in a stripped down sense. Not blessing as grand language, but as leaving behind something another person can actually use when they are standing at the edge of their own spiral. A sentence they can trust, a warning they can understand, a piece of medicine named honestly. That changed the weight of every word. Testimony stopped being self-expression and became stewardship. Over time, another role begins appearing naturally. People start bringing their stories to you, not because you advertise yourself as an expert, but because something about the way you speak suggests familiarity with this terrain. They describe their confusions, their strange experiences, and the sense that meaning has begun multiplying faster than it can be understood. Listening to these stories requires restraint. The temptation is to interpret everything through mythic language, but restraint is the real discipline. The better task is translation. In many indigenous traditions, there is a figure of the story keeper, the person who preserves difficult knowledge without distorting it. The role is not to dramatize events, but to hold them accurately so the community can learn from them. The story keeper understands that exaggeration turns wisdom into myth too quickly. Precision protects the lesson. I began recognizing how necessary that precision was. The Labyrinth easily attracts romantic interpretations. Intense experiences can sound profound when described from a distance, but from inside the journey, the reality is far more grounded. The nervous system gets overwhelmed. Sleep disappears if discipline fails. Decisions still create consequence in relationships and law. The body still has limits. The thread has to remain visible in every explanation, so translation becomes the work, turning symbolic language into practical orientation, explaining how the mind can inflate meaning when it becomes destabilized, reminding people that extraordinary insight does not remove the need for ordinary responsibility, encouraging practices that anchor perception in the physical world, regardless of how boring and repetitive they are. Exercise, routine, accountability, conversation. Story keeping is less about wisdom and more about accuracy. The traveler who survived the labyrinth becomes someone who remembers where the dangerous corridors were, not to frighten others or to feel superior for making it back, to help them walk carefully. That accuracy also changes how I use the language. Words like initiation, opening, threshold, or crisis can be useful if they reduce shame and increase care. They become dangerous the moment they replace risk assessment. I keep that line visible. Some people need community circles. Some people need clinicians. Some need both. Real containers are collaborative. The story keeper is not a replacement for them. He is a translator who helps the next person find the right doorway without turning the doorway into a cult. One of the most important decisions appears quietly during this phase, the refusal to become a guru. The temptation always exists when people begin listening to your story. They often place you on a pedestal without meaning to. They assume that surviving the labyrinth means you possess some special authority over reality. But the journey itself teaches the opposite lesson. The deeper you travel into the psyche, the more obvious its unpredictability becomes. Every culture that studied these processes warned about the danger of spiritual inflation. The moment someone begins believing they are uniquely enlightened, they have usually lost contact with the thread. The mythic mirror here appears across cultures as the figure of the elder, not the prophet standing above the community, but the older voice reminding everyone, including himself, of the basic laws of reality. Someone who reminds people not to trust every symbolic interpretation that appears in the mind. The elder understands that wisdom is mostly remembering how fragile human perception can be. Rejecting the guru identity becomes a form of protection. It protects the listener from projecting unrealistic expectations, and it protects the speaker from drifting back into the illusions that once complicated the journey. The Labyrinth taught a very simple principle. Intensity does not equal truth. The mind can generate extraordinary experiences that feel meaningful, but still require grounding before they become wisdom. Remaining ordinary becomes the discipline. Work continues. The body continues training. Conversations remain honest and practical. Law and consequence still exists. Humility becomes the only stable position inside such a complex psychological landscape. The elder does not claim to have solved the labyrinth. He simply remembers the thread and keeps pointing back to it. That is why traditions of service and holy descent matter more to me than just pure charisma. The useful figures are not the ones who just gather followers around themselves, but the ones who keep widening the field of accountability through peers and clinicians and community and prayer and correction and plain speech. The moment guidance becomes dependency, the bridge begins to rot, so I refuse the throne as a matter of hygiene. Eventually, the final piece becomes unavoidable. The role is not about telling a story. It's about accepting responsibility for the bridge between worlds. The bridge is simple. On one side exists ordinary life, work, relationships, the body's rhythms, the laws that keep society functioning. On the other side exists the deeper psychological forces that occasionally break through those structures. Crisis, symbolic experience, encounters with the shadow, moments where identity itself begins dissolving. The traveler who has walked the labyrinth learns how to stand with one foot in both territories. Myth calls this sacred responsibility. In initiation traditions, the journey does not conclude when the traveler returns. It concludes when he accepts that his knowledge now belongs partly to the community, not as an authority, not as a superior, as service. The bridge exists so that others encountering the same terrain do not believe they are alone, but the bridge also carries weight. If explanations become careless, people can misunderstand the journey and walk into extremely dangerous territories without adequate preparation. That is why the thread must remain visible in every translation and should be repeated over and over again until it becomes etched into the very fabric of one's being. Sleep protects discernment. The body stabilizes perception. Discipline keeps imagination from outrunning reality. Community prevents isolation. Law and consequence remain part of the world no matter how symbolic experience becomes. Sacred responsibility means telling the truth about the labyrinth without glorifying it. The descent was real. The danger was real. The lessons were real, but the return matters more than the fall, because the purpose of the labyrinth was never madness. The purpose was orientation. The bridge exists so the next traveler remembers the thread before entering. To become that bridge is also to accept limits. I am not the whole container. At best, I am one plank in the infrastructure. The better future I can imagine is made of many supports, grounded friends, skilled clinicians, spiritual literacy, honest language, communities that know how to hold a person without either worshipping or erasing them. If I help at all, it is by pointing toward that wider structure and by offering hope without intoxication. A bridge is only good if it holds weight in daylight. So whatever blessing I leave behind has to be testable there.